Terry Funk, more than just hardcore. Chapter 5. Road Stories. Travel in the old territories was just something you lived with. I would drive 250 miles to Abilene and back for a $25 payoff, thinking this was the greatest way of making a living in the world. It never even occurred to me there were people in the world making more than I was. We laughed a lot and shot a few rabbits along the way. We'd shoot rabbits, birds, anything that moved along the side of the road, and even the occasional cat in town. There were some real characters in Amarillo when I wrestled there in the early part of my career. I could tell Dick Murdoch stories all day. What was great about Murdoch was he was just completely goofy. When I first broke into the business, Dick was still in high school. Since he was about 2 years younger than me, he'd referee the matches. We went to Abilene one night, and the wrestlers didn't even want the fans to know the referees traveled with them. That's how serious they were about keeping appearances to protect the business. That night in Abilene, we did a deal where Dick, as the referee, got involved in the match, and he and I went at it in the ring. So later, we were getting ready to leave, and I said, "Dick, we can't go out together. People will see us. You get in the trunk, and I'll let you out as soon as we're out of sight." I shut the trunk and let him stay inside for the entire 165 miles to Odessa, and was he ever pissing and moaning. "Goddamn you, Funk. Let me out of here." Finally, he just gave up and went to sleep. And he never changed. In 1989, he, Mike Shaw, who wrestled as Norman the Lunatic, referee Tommy Young and I were on the road, and anytime Tammy Wynette came on the radio, Murdoch would give the high sign with his fingers crossed and bump me, as if to tell me he and she were real close. He never knew the broad. He didn't know her from Adam, but he'd act like they were sleeping together for years. I used to like to change his country station while he was driving. I'd find some rock station, and he was like lightning, changing it right back. "Hey. Goddammit, you leave the goddamn thing alone," he'd say. Murdoch was always afraid to go into a restaurant with me. He had his favorite places in every town, and I always screw things up by acting like an idiot. I'd ask where the restroom was and then walk into the kitchen, shit like that. One time we were in St. Louis, and we were coming out of this bar next to a grocery store when I said, "Dick, you know what would be the funniest thing in the world? If you got into one of those grocery carts and let me push you in the cart. That would be really funny." "All right, Terry." So he got into a cart, and I started him off. Pretty soon he was going about 30 miles an hour when I slammed on the brakes and let him go. He went about a block and a half down the road, cussing me the whole way. "Goddamn it, Funk, you son of a bitch. I loved that goofy bastard. I really did." Dick Murdoch was really one of the greatest workers in the entire business, but he was temperamental. If Dick, for whatever reason, decided he was going to go out there and have a stinkeroo of a match, he'd have one. It would be stinkier than what anyone else in the world could do. But when he wanted to work, by God, he could work. I am serious about Murdoch being an incredible worker. His name actually came up once in the early 1970s as a possible NWA World's Champion, but he just didn't have the political allies even to be strongly considered for it. The world title was a very political deal, as I would find out firsthand. What kind of champion would Murdoch have made? There's no telling. He'd have drank a lot of beer every night. Hell, he probably would have traded the world belt for a case of beer on the right night. Murdoch had a son running around at 6 years old wearing a hat that held a beer and had a plastic straw going from the beer to his mouth. That kid would run around sucking on that beer, and Dick was so proud of him. "That's my boy," Dick would say. Murdoch also had a dog, a bull mastiff. One day, he said he was going to the lake and asked me to come around and check his place while he was gone. It was only about 4 miles from the Double Cross Ranch, so I said I would. He had been gone for about 4 days when I went down there to check the place out. I went to the pen where he kept that bull mastiff. Dick had put a big bowl of water and 50 pounds of dog food in there. I guess the dog was supposed to regulate how much he ate every day. Dick must have thought the dog would sit there and say, "Okay, Dick's going to be gone for 6 days, so I need to eat 2 pounds today and 2 pounds tomorrow." Dick had the dog tied with a thick rope around his neck, and when I went out there, the 50 pounds of dog food was gone. That had made him thirsty, so he drank all the water. I guess he got hungry and thirsty because he had gotten so wound up that he'd pretty well hogtied himself with that rope. The dog's tongue was hanging out of his mouth. It was really sad how Murdoch died in 1996. The Thursday before he died, he ran a show in Amarillo and did about 800 people, which was a big plus for him. Now, Dick Murdoch was one of the tougher guys that I knew in my life, but Murdoch's idea about working out was, "Hey, I don't need to do shit." He'd do a set of bench press, get in 2 hours of bullshitting, and then he'd go home. He had a big gut on him, but that son of a bitch could go. I saw Murdoch run cross field with John Ayres, and Dick ran about a 4.8 seconds 40-yard dash, big gut and all. Ayres only beat him by about 3.5 yards. What I think Murdoch didn't realize was that he had been keeping in shape by wrestling. Well, when he promoted his show in Amarillo he had done a match here and there, but hadn't worked regularly in about a year. He was so enthusiastic about having such a good crowd that he went about 30 minutes that night. And to this day, I think that was the night it happened. Something happened internally to him. I think guys have to watch that. When you haven't gone for that long, don't put yourself out there for 30 minutes. The next night, Friday, he was pushing cattle at a rodeo. He and his wife owned a bar called Dick's Dive, and he told his wife, "Dadgummit, honey, I'm not feeling good. I'm going to go on home. You go close up the bar." She did, and then when she got home, he was lying on the couch. He had a bloody nose and he was dead. The bloody nose makes me think he had a stroke or something like that. Dick lived well when he was making money wrestling, but he had no money when he died. But this is an example of how Dick inspired loyalty among the people close to him. Janet, Dick's ex-wife, paid all the funeral expenses, and she works hard for her money. Murdoch should be remembered, but there are things like the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, where Murdoch's not in, and I don't think he'll ever make it in. I'd like to tell Dave Meltzer, the editor, to put him in, but he can't just do that. He has to go by the balloters. I do think if you had the boys in the business vote, they'd vote him in. But you don't have a true, balanced Hall of Fame if it's just the boys voting. Murdoch and I certainly didn't invent ribs, practical jokes, and ways to keep ourselves entertained on the road. In particular, jokes involving hitchhikers were always popular. Once when my father and Benny Trudel were traveling together, my father was driving when Benny spotted a hitchhiker in the distance. "Duree. Duree," he shouted, in his heavy, French accent. "There is one. Let's rib, the cocksucker." My father pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards ahead of the hitchhiker, who came running. When he got about 20 feet from the car, my father took off, leaving the man in a cloud of dust. "Duree. Duree," Benny shouted, laughing. "That is so funny. Do it again." My father stopped again, and knowing the hitchhiker wouldn't believe him, stuck his head out the window and said, "Come on, I was just kidding." The hitchhiker stood there and shook his head. "I promise we'll wait for you this time," my father said. Finally the hitchhiker came to the car. He got within inches of the back door when my father took off again. The hitchhiker was enraged, screaming every expletive known to man as he tried to run beside the car. Finally my father stopped again ahead of him, while Benny laughed hysterically. My father said, "Benny, you know what would be funny? Stick your ass out the window at the guy." "Ha ha ha, Duree." "I will do eat," Benny said, and he pulled down his pants and mooned the hitchhiker, who was screaming like a banshee in a rage. He raced up to the car, and as he got close, Benny said, "That is so funny, Duree. Here he comes. Let's go." Instead, my father turned and braced Benny's shoulders with both hands, holding his ass in place outside the open window. The hitchhiker ran up and began pummeling Benny's bare ass. Benny started screaming, "My God, Duree. My ass. He's hitting me in the ass. Duree." My father finally let him go, and they raced away from the furious hitchhiker. Benny had his ass bruised, as well as his pride, because he knew the story would follow him the rest of his wrestling days. My father also rode a lot with Tokyo Joe, a wrestler who was actually from Hawaii. They were going to Borger, a town 50 miles away that they ran every Friday. The referee who was working the town that night was known as the office snitch, so Joe and my dad decided to have a little fun at his expense. The referee always left at 6 p.m., so my father and Joe left at 5:30 and drove slowly, knowing that the referee, with his girlfriend in tow, she went to a lot of the matches with him, would pass them. Sure enough, the referee passed them soon enough. Then my father pulled off the road and had Tokyo Joe get in the trunk of the car. The idea was, Joe would be inside the trunk, which was shut, but not locked. When they caught up to the referee/snitch and passed him, Dad was going to honk twice, which was Joe's signal. Joe would then pop open the trunk and horrify the guy and his girlfriend with Joe's ugly ass. Well, Dad got in such a hurry to pass the guy that he sped right by a highway patrolman. The patrolman came up behind Dad to pull him over, and Dad suddenly thought of something that would be even funnier than embarrassing the snitch and his girlfriend. He honked twice, and Tokyo Joe popped up from the trunk, only to find himself exposing his hairy ass at an officer of the law. I think he figured he was in hot water pretty quick, because that patrolman hit that siren immediately. Joe just reached up, grabbed the latch and pulled the trunk closed again. Of course, the patrolman let them go, but not until my father had gone to great pains to explain the joke that was being played. But when it came to ribbing, the greatest of all was Killer Carl Cox, especially on hitchhikers. Cox would make kung fu artists out of every one of them. He'd pull up to the hitchhiker and roll down the window. Cox was a big, mean-looking guy, and he carried a glass eye that he'd put in when the occasion arose, so he looked pretty scary. He'd say, "You dumb son of a bitch. I'm gonna open up the goddamn door and come out there and kick your ass, you bastard." He'd get about 6 feet from the guy and then he'd say, "Hey, you don't know karate, do you?" The hitchhiker would just look at him. Cox would back up a couple of steps and say, "You do. You know karate, don't you?" Pretty soon, he'd have the guy in a karate stance, like Bruce Lee, or something. Cox would say, with a terrified look on his face, "I don't want to mess with you if you know karate." He'd run back to the car, and we'd take off. The guy would be back there doing goddamn kung fu thrusts and everything, chopping and kicking at thin air. Sometimes we weren't even trying to cause trouble, but trying to stop it. One time I was out with Chris Taylor, the 400-pounder who had wrestled in the Olympics. We were coming out of the Claridge Hotel in St. Louis, and we saw a man and woman having a huge fight right there on the street. Being the gentleman I am, I went to break it up and got between them. "All right," I said. "That's enough of that shit. Dadgummit, you guys break it up." The guy went into his car and pulled out a .45 caliber revolver. I jumped right behind the biggest thing I could find, which was Chris. God bless him, he was about to shit his pants. The guy couldn't even see me back there. He finally calmed down, but Chris and I were both scared shitless. Murdoch and I knew that when Art Nielsen and Eddie Graham were a tag team, they'd literally drink a case of beer every day. We idolized them when we were young, so we figured we'd be just like them. Well, many nights, Murdoch and I, and sometimes Dusty Rhodes, pulled up to my house at 2:30 in the morning, but we still had 2 6-packs left. We'd drink that up so we could say we finished our case of beer. One time, Dusty and I were coming back from Albuquerque, and we were getting drunk. We had Cowboy Lang, the midget wrestler, in the car with us. We drank and drank the beer, and pretty soon we couldn't drive anymore, either one of us. Lang was the only sober one in the car, so Dusty took off his boot, and I stuffed 2 beer cans down in it, and we put that big boot on Cowboy Lang's little leg, because that was the only way he could reach the gas pedal. That son of a bitch drove 120 miles and got us home. Nick Bockwinkel and I were in Abilene once. I was driving my 1965 Galaxy, and the air conditioner wasn't working. Well, this was the middle of summer, so it was hot as hell. We got all our beer ahead of time. I had my match, took my shower, put on my underwear, threw the rest of my clothes in my bag and tossed them into the trunk of the car. Nick and I had our beer, and the car was gassed up and ready to go. I was driving 95 miles an hour, and here came the cops. He pulled us over, and I went back to talk to him, still in my underwear. I said, "Goddamn, tonight just isn't my night. Somebody stole my bag with all my clothes in it, and now I'm getting a goddamn ticket." The cop said, "Dadgum, Terry, that's okay. I didn't know that. You guys just go on." Good thing he never looked in the trunk. I remember when Bobby Jaggers got a new convertible Corvette. God only knows who he talked into loaning him the money for it, because I know he didn't pay for it. We were going through Tulia, Texas, and it had been raining, so the underpass was just full of water. Ray Stevens and I were in his pickup truck, and we made it through the underpass, but just barely. It was a raised pickup, 4-wheel drive, and the damned water was still getting up to the floorboards. Jaggers got on his CB in his Corvette and said, "How is that underpass?" Ray got on his radio and said, "Just fine, Bobby. Come on through." He did, and that convertible was just sunk. That poor son of a bitch. Even the referees weren't safe from being the targets of ribs. Amarillo had a referee named Ken Farber, and at the time there was this synthetic drug called Dilaudid, only prescribed to cancer patients, that was about halfway between heroin and morphine and was popular in drug circles. I read about it in a newspaper, and so the next week, when Ken and I were writing to a show together, I asked Ken, "Would you mind going into the pharmacy for me and picking up something for me?" He said, "Sure." "Thanks," I said. "Just go in there and tell the pharmacist you need to pick up an order of Dilaudid. They should have it ready by now." A few minutes later, he came running out of the store. They had pitched a goddamn fit on him, and he was mad. "Damn, Terry. You trying to get me thrown in jail?" Farber used to take his pet pit bull, Buffy, to the matches. He and that dog would make the loop to El Paso, Odessa, and Lubbock. Usually, one of the locker rooms would have a 4-legged table, and Ken would leash his dog to one of the table legs. Every match he went out, that dog would go crazy with barking until Ken got back. This used to drive Al Hayes, one of our top heels, nuts, and he'd ask, in his dainty English accent, "Farber, please don't leave that dog here. Please do something else with him. Leave him in the car, or something. The dog drives us nuts when you're not back here." But each week Farber would bring that dog back. And every week that dog would be leashed to a table and bark its head off. And every week, Hayes would ask Farber not to bring the dog anymore. Maybe he didn't believe Al. After all, the dog stopped all its barking and crying whenever Farber came back to the room, so Farber just didn't realize how obnoxious that dog got when it was crying for him. One night, Farber leashed the dog to the table in the room and went out to referee. When he came back, Al Hayes was waiting for him. "Well, Farber, look what your dog has done," he said, pointing to a big turd on the floor near the dog. Farber fussed at the dog and rubbed its nose in the crap. Then, as he looked at the pile of shit, he noticed a kernel of corn and a peanut, and he realized his dog didn't eat corn or peanuts. Al Hayes did, though. Farber never brought that dog to the matches again. Yes, Al Hayes was a wonderful worker and every bit as good a ribber. He was also a great talker and even did some commentary for us in Amarillo. People who only heard him in the WWF would probably never believe how sharp and smart he was. Sometimes an idea for a rib would just pop into my head. For example, at one point, Gary Hart was managing a guy called the Moon Man. I think he also wrestled as Masabu. He had no front teeth and crazy, spiked hair going in all directions. He was working for Fritz, and was drawing pretty well, so Junior and I brought him in to work a shot in San Angelo, Texas, as an attraction. He was Mexican and couldn't speak a word of English. I picked him up at the little airport in San Angelo and told him, "I take you to hotel." He looked at me for a second and said, "Okay." No English whatsoever. We were going down the road when we came upon an old folks' home. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be funny to set him loose in an old folks' home? We pulled into the driveway and stopped. I pointed to the building and said, "Here, hotel." He said a bunch of shit in Spanish I didn't understand and then, "Okay." He got out of the car and I motioned between myself and his bag, letting him know I'd get it. "You go in door," I said, pointing at the door. "Ask for room." Room. So this crazy-looking Mexican walked into the old folks' home shouting, "Room. Room." A bunch of those old sons of bitches were looking around like their world was about to end, and then he realized where he was and ran out of there, back to the car. I was laughing. He wasn't. One of the best ones I ever did was with Rick Martel when he was a rookie and coming down to Florida. He was riding with Dick Slater and me one day, and I said, "Hey, Rick. You know what would be really funny?" He answered in his thick French-Canadian accent, "What, Terry?" At the next stoplight we come to, I said, "It would be a funny son of a bitch if you took off all of your clothes when we stopped, got out, ran around the car naked and jumped back in the back door." He laughed and said, "Yes. Now, you have to understand in Florida, they have these gullies that are full of water, to keep the roads from flooding and help with drainage." He got out of the car, naked, and started running. When he got behind the door, Slater locked the door and I took off. He was running down the road, totally naked, shouting, "Wait. Wait." He didn't know what to do, so he jumped into the damn gully. When we went back around to get him, he looked like a damn turtle, with just his head sticking out of the water. Nowadays, they travel by plane, and I think one of the problems with the wrestling business today is that they don't have the bonding to the same extent that we did. Of course, as I was living proof, it was entirely possible to have as crazy an experience in an airplane as you could in a car. Junior and I used to love playing tricks on the other passengers on planes. One of our favorites was the empty luggage trick. Junior, who's been bald-headed for most of his adult life, had this awful-looking toupee, which he put on the top of his head before getting on a plane. He would always get on board before me. When I got on, I would have an empty bag with me, and I'd be struggling with the thing as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. I'd carry it for about 10 feet, then set it down and make like I had to catch my breath. Junior would be in his seat while this was going on. I'd finally lift the thing up as I got to the overhead compartment over Junior, who would be acting like he didn't know me. Everyone around would be watching as I staggered back and forth before finally getting it into the overhead rack. When I did, I would bring my hand down and knock his toupee to one side, not all the way off, but enough to be seriously lopsided. Then, I'd go to my seat, a couple of rows behind him. The funniest thing, to us, was that no one would ever tell him about it. He'd be sitting there with a wig on the side of his head for the whole flight. Boy, the things we did to occupy our time.